So I'm making this video in hopes of whoever plans on buying the Ford PowerPack 2 can have a more informed decision, and maybe this will answer a few more questions that I had when I was shopping for it. I'm going to try to make this as informative as possible, try to keep out any fluff, because I hate watching videos where they just add a bunch of unnecessary things. So getting straight to it, what comes with the Ford PowerPack 2 is the actual ProCal unit, which I don't have with me, which you use to tune the car. You get the air intake itself and the filter and the throttle body that comes from the GT350. The only thing different I have here is a pre-filter from K&N. Kind of helps keep the filter cleaner a bit longer, and also it's kind of a bit of a water shield, so that if any water does come from this vent in here, it'll kind of shed off of the pre-filter instead of getting into the filter media. I'm not too worried about that. I've sprayed water up through this vent before, and I haven't had any water get directly on the filter. I don't know if it'll show up on camera, but there's actually some water spots here from water coming in before. It usually goes behind the filter, not directly onto the filter. So I'm not really worried about water getting on the filter. Now, the connector right here, this does not come with the kit. I actually bought this on Amazon. I saw it on the forum. It looks a lot cleaner than using the instructions that come with the kit. And as you can see, it does rub a little bit right here, but it's not really much of a concern for me. Other than that, and a catch can, the car is pretty much stock otherwise, besides an exhaust. And also, one thing I did was I opened up these little vents here. I took a Dremel and pulled out all these honeycombs from the back so that it opened up this more, so it'll get more air into the air intake. And I don't know if it makes that big of a difference, but to me it looks nicer. And that's pretty much it. Alright, so let's jump into it. The reason I went with the Ford Performance PowerPack 2 was for a couple reasons. Primarily being I get to keep my warranty, which is pretty important to me, till at least 36,000 miles. Next, I know that Ford Performance has access to tools for the calibrations that aftermarket tuners like Lund and AED won't have access to. Not to say that there's anything bad about Lund or AED or any other tuner besides Mama. Also, it wasn't too cost inhibitive to go with the PowerPack 2, considering it includes the air intake, calibration, and the throttle body. I think it's a pretty good deal for what I paid for it, which was $608. And then I paid about $130 for it to be installed. Now, the reason I had it installed instead of installing it myself is because you have to have it installed by either a dealer or an ASE certified technician in order to maintain your warranty. And then once you have it installed, you have to submit your paperwork, like your receipts and everything, where you bought it from, who you had installed it, to Ford Performance, and they will register your warranty for you, so that if anything happens, you'll have that to fall back on. Which I have pretty good confidence in this engine so far. It hasn't given me any reason to suspect that anything is going to go wrong, but I just like to cover my ass. Now, the install itself was pretty straightforward and simple. Like I said, I would rather do it myself. I'm not a huge fan of going to shops to do work for me. I usually do all my installs myself if I can, depending on if I don't have the tools or not. But like I said, in order to keep my warranty, I had to do that. And so I took it to a friend of mine who actually worked at a shop that I felt comfortable going to, and took about an hour to install it. Initial impressions, the first thing I noticed was, before I even got out of the parking lot, the throttle response and throttle mapping overall was miles better than it was stock. Since I have a base GT, I'm limited to just having, I guess, the normal mode, which means that I can't change throttle mapping like you can on a premium to sport or track, to make the throttle a little bit more sensitive, a little bit more reactive when you give throttle inputs. So the throttle inputs from factory are kind of dull and numb, and I never really liked that coming from a cable-driven throttle body on my last car. But that's the first thing I noticed. Second thing I noticed, there is a pretty significant increase in torque from low RPM. I'd say above 2,500 RPM, you'll notice a significant increase in torque. Is it the 40 foot-pounds of torque that Ford advertises? I wouldn't quite go that far, and I'll explain in a moment. but overall there is a significant increase in power. I didn't really get to test it out too much just driving around the shop, because they just wanted me to make sure that everything was okay. I didn't have any check engine lights or anything, which I didn't. And then I was on my way. On my way back from the shop, I noticed, well, I was in a lot of traffic, so I was noticing my intake temperatures were going up pretty high fairly quickly. Now, I know that bothers some people. It goes up to about 30 degrees above ambient and about 80-degree weather is the max I saw. It's not too alarming to me, because once you get moving again, it goes down pretty quickly. I did open up the honeycomb in the grill. I don't know if that makes that big of a difference or not. And you know what, if traffic opens up a little bit, I may do a quick pull using no lift shift. I won't do it in first and second because it doesn't work well in first and second. I might not be able to do it. Let's see. And I'll talk about the no lift shift a little more in a minute. But getting back to leaving the shop, I had the windows cracked open a little bit, and the air intake temps were a little bit higher than I would have liked. But like I said, they went down pretty quickly once you get moving. But I noticed once I got onto the on-ramp, I had the windows cracked a little bit, and I could hear kind of it sounded like a loose metallic noise in my exhaust, like a piece of metal was rattling in my exhaust. So initially I thought that a baffle head came loose in my Corsa exhaust, so I was actually getting kind of pissed. And I noticed that it would only happen at about anything over 70% throttle at about 3,000 RPM to maybe 4,500 RPM in about third, fourth gear. And then I kept doing it a couple times. I'd slow down, try it again, slow down, try it again. And then I noticed that it was actually ping or knock. It wasn't anything wrong with my exhaust. And so that really started to worry me, because anytime you hear audible knock, that's not a good thing, no matter what anybody says. So I was pretty disappointed from that start, because I only driven the car maybe 20 minutes and I'm already hearing knock. My plan after that was the next day after I got up at work to change the, there's a little option in the ProCal tool from Ford that they give you to calibrate the vehicle, to switch it to a lower octane map for people that live in areas where they only have access to 91 octane. Which, me personally, I have access to 93, and I usually only use top tier 93 octane fuel. So I thought I was using pretty good fuel, but apparently not. On my previous vehicle that I actually did tune myself, I didn't have any issues with knock, out of the ordinary at least, with the fuel I've been using. So that was a bit worrisome. But the next day, after I got off of work, went home, grabbed the laptop, and I said, you know what, let me drive around for a little bit. So drove around the block a few times, tried to get it to do the same thing it was doing the day before, but I couldn't get it to knock anymore. So I'm guessing the ECU pulled enough timing to where it wouldn't knock, at least audibly, to where I could hear it anymore. So I left it on the setting that it was originally, and I haven't heard any knock since. I know a lot of guys complained about that initially, but I kind of wonder how long they actually driven the car before they switched to a lower map or switched it back to stock, the ones that did switch back to stock, because like I said, since that day I haven't had any issues with knock, and that was about 5,000 miles ago. Now, speaking of knock, this calibration from Ford Performance uses a different, I guess you could call it knock logic. Instead of global, it switches to per cylinder knock. So what that means is it tries to pinpoint from the two knock sensors on the top of the engine block exactly which cylinder is knocking, and then it pulls timing from just that one cylinder instead of an entire bank or the entire 8 cylinders. And that can help keep the power instead of pulling timing from all the cylinders and losing more power than you normally would with the global knock logic. Now that has its positives and negatives. There's only 2 knock sensors between the 8 cylinders, so it can only be so accurate in my opinion. But I guess time will tell how it holds up. Now I kind of touched on air intake temps. While you're moving, mine stay within 4 to 5 degrees of ambient temp. And then, like I said, once you get into traffic, it can climb up easily to 30, maybe even 40 degrees above ambient. But once you start moving and get above like 20 miles an hour, 30 miles an hour, you'll notice they climb down fairly quickly. Now, I chose to keep the paper element air filters, and I will do so for the near future. And my reason for that is because I've had not the best experience using reusable filters like K&N, Air-Aid, AEM. I've had an oil analysis done on my last vehicle, and I used the paper element filter, got the oil analysis done, and then I switched to a K&N and then got it done afterwards. And the amount of contaminants I had in the later oil analysis was significantly higher than with the paper element filter. So that kind of turned me off of using K&N filters. And when you think about it, yeah, you are kind of saving the money by washing and reusing the filter. But there's a reason they say you can go up to 40, 50,000 miles without even cleaning the filter. It's not catching that much as far as contaminants go. And so you got to keep that in mind. You're sacrificing possibly the longevity of your engine for a, what, 3 to 4 horsepower increase in high RPM ranges? That's not worth it to me. I'd rather have my engine last a little bit longer and use the paper element filters, which for the PowerPack 2, they can be pretty pricey if you can't find a deal on them. Now the intake noise, I don't have the sound tube anymore. You have to get rid of it when you get the PowerPack 2. So it actually quiets a bit in the lower RPM range. But there is a bit more resonance, and it's kind of hard for me to describe it. It's more of like a high-pitched vibration through the cabin. I wouldn't call it annoying or anything. It's nothing to write home about. Most people probably won't even notice it. But about 3,000, 3,500 RPM on upwards, you'll start to notice that intake noise come in through the cabin. And it's a lot different from the sound tube that the factory intake has. And also, when you turn off the car, it'll have what's called the thump from the throttle body off. It just closes the throttle body to keep emissions down. And so if you hear that thump whenever you turn off the car, it's completely normal. If you just got it installed or you installed the PowerPack 2 yourself, it's nothing to worry about. Now, gas mileage. I don't see how installing this would affect your gas mileage negatively or positively, other than your driving habits and your driving environment. If you're in the exact same driving environment and driving habits, I would expect the gas mileage to be exactly the same. Mine went down, but that's because my driving habits changed after installing this. I drive the car a little bit harder now, so of course the gas mileage went down. I think it was 0.2 miles per gallon it went down, but that doesn't bother me. Now back to the power delivery. I don't think that I'm getting 40 pound-feet of torque gain at 1500 RPM. And I think that's because the PCM pull timing that first day from the initial pulls I was trying to do when I was getting onto the on-ramp. And that's why I'm not feeling that huge surge of torque at 1500 RPM. Now keep in mind, I don't exactly floor my car all the time at 1500 RPM. I don't like bogging it and giving it full throttle that low. It puts a lot of stress on many engine components because the combustion events last a lot longer. And so I just don't see a point in it, either downshift or wait until you get a little higher up in the RPM range to get on it. But with that being said, I don't think it's going to be quite 40 foot-pounds. I think it'll be more significant if that were the case, and I don't think it's just that significant. Like I said, the power increase is noticeable, but it's not going to be night and day. It's not going to change your life by any means. But it is a very welcome difference. Now, the power delivery in and of itself is fairly smooth. There will be a few times where I'll feel it pull timing, and it'll seem like the power is fluctuating a bit. But that's usually when I have a big temperature change. Living in the south, we'll have days where it's like 40 degrees one day and 80 the next. And so I think that's just the PCM kind of adjusting timing wise to make sure that the engine's running the way it should and not getting too much knock. But overall, it's fairly smooth. Drivability wise, it's just like stock, except for the increased throttle mapping and throttle response. There's no adverse effects, just cruising around and driving normally. No jerkiness when the engine's cold or anything like that. Now, for the added features like no lift shift, when I first tried the no lift shift, I failed to use it properly, and I didn't realize it at the time because you have to give it 100% throttle when you're shifting. If you let off a little bit and you're at 99% throttle or less, the no lift shift will not activate, and you'll end up just bouncing off the rev limiter, which the rev limiter is different too. I'll tell you about that in a little bit. But one thing I had to learn and force myself to do was actually force myself to keep the throttle planted, because after all these years of driving a manual and being used to taking my foot off, because I never power shift the car. I don't like it. I don't see a point in it, and I don't see how it's beneficial speed wise, but I don't like power shifting, and so it was really hard for me to get used to that. But once I got used to it, the no lift shift is actually smoother than actually quick shifting yourself. And the reason for that is when you use the no lift shift feature and you engage the clutch back in, it feeds the throttle in progressively. It does it quickly, but it does it progressively so that it's a lot more smoother when you're engaging the throttle and the engine's connecting back to the transmission. Whereas with quick shifting, you're literally on the clutch, off the gas, and then hurrying back on the gas and off the clutch. So you have that drivetrain shock. And I know one YouTuber mentioned that no lift shift will destroy MT82 transmissions. This iteration of it, I don't see how it would. In fact, I think it would be quite the opposite, because as I mentioned, it actually smoothens out the shifts. Now, as a result, there's a con to that, which is your shift times are a little bit slower, at least in my case. So that is a slight downside, but it's still a fun feature to mess around with. Now, the launch control. Launch control from the factory wasn't the most useful, especially if you're on the 235s that comes with the car. I'm on 275s now, but I don't have the stickiest of tires because I'm trying to save my half shafts, at least until I'm ready to upgrade them. But the launch control after you install the PowerPack 2, at least in my situation, is pretty much useless, and there's two reasons for that. I have it on the lowest setting, which is at 3,000 RPM, and it'll still roast down the tires completely. And also, I'm getting a strong smell of clutch, and I'm overheating the clutch. And I know that I'm overheating the clutch because from the factory, the clutches that come in these cars on the 2015 to 2017 Mustangs, they have a clutch pad material that is very sensitive to heat. So if you heat the clutch up too much, it'll actually leave uneven deposits on your flywheel, kind of like when you have pulsation in your brakes. And it'll actually cause it to judder when you take off from a light or when you're normally driving and you're pulling off from somewhere. Now that'll go away after pulling off from a stop sign or a light a few hundred times. It'll smoothen back out, so it's nothing permanent, but it's still annoying to deal with if you overheat the clutch. But it seems like no matter how I use the launch control, whether I engage the clutch quickly or slowly, it seems to always burn up the clutch. And you'll notice it because you'll smell it. But even if it didn't burn up the clutch, it still just roasts down the tires anyway, so I can't set the launch control low enough to where I don't have traction issues right now. Now, the rev limiter. The rev limiter is raised to 7,300 RPM. From the factory, I could be able to rev it out to 6,800 RPM, and then as soon as you would hit that 6,800 RPM, it would immediately just shut the throttle and the car would decelerate until it either got below a certain RPM or you let out the throttle and got back on it. Now, I actually kind of prefer that. I know a lot of people don't like that because it kind of like shuts the door on you, but I prefer it because these cars don't have the strongest oil pump gears, and that kind of rev limiter helps preserve them versus having the traditional style one, which is where it bounces off at a certain RPM range from like 72 to 7,300 RPM, which is what it does now with this calibration. And with that raised rev limit, you'll be able to, at least the guys with 373 gears, be able to hit 60 miles per hour pretty easily. So that can help your 0 to 60 times if you have stickier tires than I do. But in my case, it just slowed down my 0 to 60 because I can't control the wheel spin enough. Which, by the way, my quickest OEM 0 to 60 is 4.9, which isn't very good. But I haven't really done it a whole lot. Puts a lot of stress on the car. And oh, by the way, for those of you that didn't know, if you have a manual transmission GT and you have the launch control on, it also serves as a good warm-up light. It makes sure that the oil temperature is where it should be, and then it'll show you the LC on the gauge cluster to let you know that the car is warmed up enough. You can't just go by coolant temp, because coolant temp's one thing, but your oil temp's another thing. Your oil is always going to take a little bit longer than your coolant to warm up. So even though your coolant temp may be in the middle, it doesn't necessarily mean that the car is warmed up and ready for you to really get on it. The cold starts are a bit louder, especially when it's really cold outside. And the overall exhaust note, this may be kind of a placebo effect to me. It does seem slightly throatier and a bit louder, but like I said, it could just be in my head. If that is the case though, it's a very minor difference and pretty hard to discern. So it's not like you're gonna automatically have to go back to the stock exhaust and your aftermarket exhaust is gonna be too loud or anything. I don't think that's gonna be the case. One thing I did like that it changed, that the calibration changed with the exhaust, is that when you let up the throttle and you're decelerating in gear, it has a lot more pops and burbles than it did stock with a regular calibration from the factory. And so that's a clip I'll throw in now. Also, while I'm at it, I should have a clip of using the no lift shift. And also, if you have a long duration while you're shifting and you engage the clutch slowly again when you're getting back on the throttle, it'll have kind of like a stuttering sound, which I'll throw a clip of that in. But overall, I would say if you're looking to get the PowerPack 2 for your Mustang GT, go for it. If you've got the extra cash, I'd say it's worth it. Now, if you're not worried about the warranty, then I'd probably lean towards getting an aftermarket tune. Simply because I would prefer to run the 85, but of course I can't do that with this. And I would need an aftermarket tune to do that. So, other than that, there's really no huge downsides to having this. But thanks for watching. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments below, and I'll try my best to answer them to my abilities. And have a good day.